Hi, how are you today? Um, Welcome to 52 Weeks of Health Equity. I'm Sahisha Timmons, and I will be your host today. And I have Sydney Butler here with me. Sydney, I would love if you could introduce yourself, talk about who you are, and why you're here with our podcast.
Yeah, so I go by Sydney Elaine Butler, or Sydney Butler, and I am the founder of Accessible Creates, a company where I help other businesses be more accessible and inclusive, especially to people with disabilities, because there's a lot of barriers that they face in the workplace. And so I study HR at school and bringing those two passions of my lived experience of being disabled as well as HR to make the workplace better.
That sounds like very important work. And so, when you talk about accessibility in the workplace, do you
Mhm,
mind going just a little deeper into what
mhm.
are the type of things that you help um, organizations with or workplaces with?
Yeah, so I help organizations understand that they already have disabled talent and neurodivergent talent in the workplace. A lot of times, companies right now are focusing on recruiting talent, and I also focus on that as well, but also telling them that, hey, you already have this talent in your workplace. This is how you have to better support them and talk about accommodation and accessibility in the workplace, as you know, how to break down those barriers and talking to them about the barriers that do exist for people with disabilities that exist in the workplace and how to start removing those barriers.
Wow, wow. And so I heard you talk a little bit about how this is probably a personal interest too,
Mm-hmm.
but what drew you to the work? Like, why did you feel like I need to work with organizations or companies or
Mm-hmm.
workplaces?
Yeah, I think understanding that I think the organizations and work is such a everyday practice, and every day we all do it, and everyone deserves to have a barrier-free work environment. But a lot of people don't know what that actually looks like, and so a lot of times organizations, they a lot of times before the pandemic, organizations thought people had to be a good fit for them, but the organization also has to be a good fit for the person, and so flipping that narrative.
Wow, I love that you said prior to the pandemic, organizations felt that people had to fit them, right?
Hmm.
And so now more organizations are looking at how they can be better engaged with their employees and potential perspectives.
Hmm.
And so, from a health perspective, what does it look like when people kind of feel like they have to fit? Is
Hmm.
there any reason why this would be a health issue? Like it seems like
Hmm.
you should just go to work and do your job and
Hmm.
it's work. Like why do you need to why should they
Yeah,
focus
if
on
it,
this?
when you don't feel included, you don't feel like you belong. Yeah, like the cases that it's just a work, just a job, just to get money, and that should be enough. But we know as human beings, we want fulfillment. We want to have passion in what we do. We want to feel included in everything we do, and work's such a huge part of our lives. And it takes such a toll on us. We enjoy the work we're doing. If we enjoy the company of what we're doing, and a lot of times people quit jobs because of other people or the politics, as people say, or managers, and so really understanding that the toxicity is that slowly breaks someone down and chips at them, and so it's important to have that culture of inclusive culture and actually be authentic with it.
Yeah, and I noticed you mentioned authentic. And
Hmm.
so that seems to be a buzzword, right? Like people
Hmm.
bringing their authentic self and being able to fully feel fulfilled. And we have seen that, in the US and worldwide,
Hmm.
we're kind of in a mental health crisis.
Hmm.
And so do you feel like that's part of what you help with a little bit?
Yeah, I think the employee well-being overall. A lot of companies, like you said, authentic and mental health. I think is even being a buzzword right now. And they don't really know what it means. They're like, okay, there's is the job impacting your mental health, and this the current climate. It's still in a pandemic. But we're still kind of out of it. Some people are wearing masks, some people aren't, and we're in a really interesting time right now. And just being mindful that people's mental health and stress levels are high and all these different factors. And so just being mindful and being like, okay, if a person wants to bring the whole self to work, and what parts of them do they want to bring to work? Which parts do they want to show? What parts allow them to be more productive and allow for them to feel more safe and feel more valued at work.
So, you've talked a lot about how, this helps people with belonging,
Yeah.
this helps organizations to support them. So, what do you think are the biggest barriers that are out there when it comes to accessibility in the workplace?
I think this seems with mental health, it's all comes back down to attitudinal barriers and the attitude. So how people perceive mental health, how people perceive accessibility and disability. A lot of times people before the pandemic, people with accessibility using a ramp, having the access into the building, physical access, having accessible washrooms, and it's so much bigger than that. And really understanding that and then also a lot of times like, oh, I work with someone else that uses a wheelchair. I know how to accommodate you, or I have a nephew that's autistic. And equating people's experiences, but we all have different experiences. We all have different things we experience in the day or in our lives that make us who we are, and so just being mindful of how we approach others.
So, you mentioned something when you were talking just then. Um, that we almost have this like preconceived notion that we
Hmm.
can apply how we accommodated the last person we
Hmm.
ran into to the next person, right? So
Hmm.
that sounded sort of like what you were referring to.
Hmm.
So do you help them to kind of individualize that concept around, you may have someone who's asking for an accommodation
Hmm.
or needs support, and they don't, is that what you see, like organizations just don't know how to
Yeah,
support
they
that
like to
person?
they don't know how to support that person. They refer back to the other person. It's like if it worked before, awesome, great, help that person. If it could potentially help this person, have that conversation. Like, hey, this is what we did last time. Is this something you want to try? Would this also work for you? But not just having that be the end all be all. Oh, we've done that before. Just doing the same recycled accommodation instead of working with the individual and having the individual plan.
Yes, and so it's so important because people are unique. But if I've accommodated someone
Hmm.
with a neurodiversity before, why
Hmm.
can't I just apply that to every
Hmm.
single neurodiverse person? That seems like easy. Like
Hmm.
I'll just make a
Hmm.
plan and that's what I'll do. Is that like why is that not okay to
I
do?
think like you can like try that and see if it does work, but also don't be like, oh, that should have worked because it worked last time. That's where the issue comes in. It's like, okay, for example, if someone with ADHD, working closely with them to work with deadlines and having that in place, it's like okay, or having even a lot of times having written instructions instead of verbal instructions, because it's like you need to see it and be able to refer to it later if you forget, if you've been working on so many different tasks and you get overwhelmed, and so referring to that later instead of just verbally saying, then it's like okay, what did they say again? What were the specifics? And then so if that works, this things that will work over and over again, but also being mindful that it's not one size fits all.
Yeah, that one size fits all. And it seems like we shouldn't think in the one size fits
Hmm.
all manner when it comes to supporting people at work. Is that more common than we think it is? Because like I often think like, okay, um, you know, organizations are about reflecting the uniqueness of their employees, but that probably isn't
Hmm.
true. Is that correct? Like,
Yeah,
and
that's
is it more expensive to do it that way? Like, is that why they don't do it? Like, is it
it's
more
like a lot of I
harder?
think when people think accommodation, they usually think medical accommodation, and they kind of and that could be quite pricey. And but it's like most of the time it's just reasonable accommodation. They cost most accommodations cost nothing at all. Just modifying your job duties, and just changing the way you do it, having the conversation, having the written instructions and the verbal instructions. It's just little things. But I think there's just still a stigma around accommodation and disability in the workplace. And they think it's too expensive. So,
So it's not expensive most of the times to accommodate
hmm.
people. Um, and so if it's not expensive to accommodate for the
Hmm.
most part, people who come asking for something, why don't we do it? Like, why
Hmm.
don't we kind of keep more people in the workplace
Hmm.
versus not? Like, is it some type of unconscious bias that we have around disability?
I think it is some unconscious bias towards disability. And again, like I said, the accommodation, just think expensive when they hear that word. Like accommodation, like everyone's like, what, too expensive? Or then a lot of times they don't know that it can be so simple. Or a lot of times they think, when someone gets injured at work, then that's a disability. They don't understand that people with disabilities actually went into the workplace. They're already in the workplace and that are doing their job. They just need a little bit more support sometimes.
And I noticed in the beginning you mentioned you help them accommodate those who are already at work or just kind of
Yes.
work through the
Hmm.
plan and the strategy, but also when people are coming into the workplace.
Hmm.
So I will tell you that I have been a little fearful to put that I have a disability on
Hmm.
job applications because I'm afraid that they're going to not even
Hmm.
look at me as an employee. Do you do any work with the organization or do you do any
Yeah.
work in the community to kind of get rid of that one, the fear for the people applying, and
Hmm.
then working with like groups to just better understand what disability could look like?
Yeah, I do a lot of training on what the disability awareness. What is a disability? What does it look like? A lot of times people like there's so many invisible disabilities too. And so understanding that people are like, oh, I know a disability when I see it. It's like what we don't look disabled, but it's like there's no one look to be disabled. And so, what does it actually look like? What does it actually look like in a work setting? You know, Working with them on the job postings. To actually show that they are an accessible and inclusive employer. A lot of times, employers are like, oh, see, we're accessible, we're inclusive, just having that accommodation statement, or they don't, but it's not even fully saying that they can accommodate the individual or how to go about accommodating the individual. And a lot of times, the language that's being used on these job postings and job descriptions, they don't realize, and that's what I help with, using that more inclusive and using that plain language because, sometimes you look at a job description and it's a must have, for example, one example I always use is driver's license. It's like, do they actually need a driver's license to, do you need a driver's license? You actually have to drive around for your job, or is it just because they want you to have a reliable transportation way to get to work? There's other reliable ways to get to work, and a lot of times, like, oh, we just want them to have a good way to get to work and know that they can get here on time, get here efficiently. But it's like if it's not essential for the job duties, it shouldn't be on there.
Wow. And so I think you just called out something huge. If it's not essential for the
Hmm.
job duties, it shouldn't be on there. Because the other thing is, I know that's like, I don't know if you've seen these, but like job postings where there's just so much information
Hmm.
in there. And like, it's almost like you're getting fatigue even reading
Hmm.
to figure out, well, what do I need to bring into
Yes.
here? And then the driver's license thing was interesting because I think I saw it was, it might have been even like a retailer that
Hmm.
said like must have a driver's license. And I thought to myself, like, why would you need a driver's license to
Hmm.
go work retail? And so that explanation of needing to have reliable transportation, like as a substitute for that, like like that concept of like, what do you need versus like,
Hmm.
what do you dream of this person,
Hmm.
having and maybe jargon. Like it sounds
There's a
like,
lot. There's a lot of jargon, industry jargon, company jargon. It's like we don't know what that means. It means something to you, but the outsider doesn't know what it means. It's just confusing. They can Google it, but and then it doesn't have the same context that you mean it in, and it just becomes a mess.
it sounds like it really does because, we want to say that we're inclusive,
Hmm.
right? But we sometimes don't have the support. So it sounds like you provide that support to kind of walk through, for groups and companies. Like this is the benefit. And so, is there a benefit to having people in your workplace who have disabilities? Like, what's
Yeah,
the benefit?
a lot of times, companies like, oh, if they have a disability, then they're not going to be they're going to be late or they're going to be not show up, and it's actually the opposite. People with disabilities, they increases, decreases turnover. Works goes to work more
Wait a
excited,
second.
and all these
You just said
things.
it decreases turnover. How is that even like is so there's research out there saying
Yeah,
that it decreases turnover. So then I why are we not being more open to that? Like,
again, it goes back to the preconceived notion. That perception of disability is so ingrained in so many people's heads, and I think it's slowly being broken down. But people are like, oh, people just they're sick all the time, or they have all these complications, and it's not going to work. It's like that's not the case, and showing the research and showing the findings, and be like, no, and also increases innovation. For because having the different perspective and bringing that into the organization. And so a lot of times where people start, it goes back to the attitudes and that I talked about previously. It's all about the attitude and how people perceive disabilities, and this just a negative connotation. Even with the word disabled and disability, people are like, can we say it? Like, I don't know if we can say it. They think it's a bad word. Or even when I say it, I'm like, say the word, like in my trainings. And then always one of the questions I get after, even though I say to say disabled in my presentation, they're like, people are like, are you sure I can say that? Because I remember before, even just like 10 years ago, you couldn't say the word disabled. And it's like, we kind of, right now things are changing so fast and we're claiming that language, and every language gets reclaimed. And then, I say, then, a lot of times the word special needs is thrown around, special education. And I'm like, don't say that. Like, what? That's what we've been saying. And it's just, the mind shift change and changing the language. And then again, it goes back to the perceptions and how we've perceived for so long.
I love that you talked about language because language, I think, sometimes can be a barrier, right?
Hmm.
Both from the side of like, you want to be inclusive and you want to be doing the right thing. And then employers or work
Hmm.
groups, sometimes they're so cautious to
Hmm.
say the right thing that they get stuck, right? Like,
Hmm.
it's hard, like, that becomes their barrier. And so it's almost like you're helping organizations to kind of build relationships where they can feel comfortable having trust. And so from a health equity perspective, um, when we talk about equity and reducing
Hmm.
barriers and increasing access, having more people in the workplace, what's the benefit?
It helps the company overall, helps society, different perspectives, getting people different opportunities, and really understanding that at the end of the day, if people want to work, they should be able to work. And it's so interesting too because a lot of times with disability, people are paid less than minimum wage or paid because they're like, oh, we'll pay them
Wait, wait,
less.
wait. How can they pay them
They
less?
pay them.
The mi-
They pay them less than minimum wage. Sometimes there's like in some legislation there's disabled.
Wow, wow. So not only so basically you just said that disabled workers have less turnover. There's higher, retention with them.
Mhm.
It sounds like they're very loyal and
Mhm.
committed, and then they get paid less. That
Mhm.
sounds completely unfair because it costs a
Mhm.
lot to train people, right?
It costs a lot to train people, and then also, I think like things are slowly changing right now, and it's not in every place they get paid less. But in a lot of places, you'd be surprised. You're like, what? How did they get paid less? And it's still the wage gap disparity. They're like, okay, well, we did the requirement, we can pay them less, and it's a whole mess. It needs to be changed. The whole structure needs to be changed because a lot of people, again, it goes back to the perceptions. It's like, okay, oh, but they're just thankful to have a job, so therefore we can pay them less.
One more time with that because that was powerful. That what you just said, like, to be thankful to have a job, so they should be thankful we're
Hmm.
paying them less. Wow, that is an attitude, right? And we've seen that in other
Hmm.
groups that are not considered the
Yeah.
majority. That people should just be grateful to be
Hmm.
in the workplace, to be around other people. That is such a powerful statement that you just said, Sydney. Wow. Like that, see this with women too, right? Like
Yeah.
that gendered pay ba- gap and barrier. And so what happens if you have intersections of
Hmm.
different like, is that even worse? Like,
It's a whole the diversity, equity, inclusion. There's so much work to be done because all the disparity, and then people are like, well, if they get more, then It's like they should just be grateful for what they have. It's just like things are changing so fast right now. Like I keep saying, and it's just being mindful. It's like things is changing. Someone brings a whole self to work. We all have intersectional identities, no matter who we are, you know. And it's like disabled. I'm disabled, biracial, bisexual, like all these different things. That's my whole identity and more. And so being mindful, and a lot of times people don't disclose that they have a disability because, or unless you can't tell by looking at people sometimes, and so people try to hide their identities, be like, to get that pay, just being mindful.
Yeah, like and so that thankful piece, we've heard it over and over
Hmm.
again. BIPOC people,
Hmm.
Black people of color, Indigenous people should be thankful just to be in the workplace, right? Women should be thankful. The myth that we don't have expenses, that
Hmm.
we may not be the head of household, that we may not be the sole support for ourselves, that allowing to be paid less, I can see that as being like probably a real myth and barrier
Hmm.
and bias that's out there. This belief that someone is probably helping with your bills, or you're getting some
Hmm.
subsidy, or like that you're not the sole source of support for yourself when you're in a group, right? That is
Hmm.
considered to be that most individuals don't know a lot about, or have a lot of I'll even say empathy for.
Yeah.
Um, so, so it sounds like we need to be more emotionally intelligent too, and
Yes.
more empathetic, um, to be able to see ourselves in those places. And so, do you mainly work with HR groups and like those type of organizations? Do you work with
So
communities?
I help with, like, I mostly train HR professionals because that's again my background. But then I also help any company across any industry, like small to medium sized organizations. Startup companies are interested, but they don't have the capital. They only have that one person in that position. And then bigger companies, bigger traditional companies, they have to go through more people. Like the person I talk to, they're all excited and want to bring her back, and then there's three yeses and two nos, and then they're kind of like,
Mm,
what do we do? And so I found that small to medium sized organizations, and training HR on this matter, and because I with HR too, HR is usually the first impression a person gets of the company and how people perceive the company, and so it's important that they know what to do and help break down those barriers. And I remember one of my friends, she's like, "You in HR, right?" I was like, "Yes." And she's also autistic, and she was like, one of the I made a post, and this HR lady was completely biased and they completely shut her down on her post and was like, "No, you're lying. You don't deserve to work, all these things."
oh my
And I
God.
was like, "What?" And so I think there's still that negative perception, and
An
again,
HR person,
yes, and a
HR
lot,
who we think should kind of
yeah.
know.
A lot
Okay.
but you don't. If you don't know, you don't know. That's a huge
Mm,
issue with any area of diversity, equity, inclusion. You don't know what you don't know. And like you brought up before, if I can bring back to that point when you were like how companies, they have this bias, or they for anyone that's racialized or queer or disabled, and then they don't want to say the wrong thing, right? And so they don't say anything at all, basically. And it's like they're like, I'm too scared to say anything. I don't want to say the wrong thing, especially in this current climate. The tensions are high. But I'm like, the worst thing you can say is nothing. You know, just start learning and be transparent. Hey, I'm learning right now. I've been trying this out. This is a give and take. Even like when you're accommodating someone with disability, and you're trying this new accommodation, or you're trying the other accommodation you tried before, be like, hey, we know this is we're learning alongside you, and just being transparent with your employees is very important.
I'm going to find out,
Mm-hmm.
or like, I'm going to help you, than just making something up or not answering me and like
Mm-hmm.
ignoring. So, neurodiversity is very interesting because there's this thought that autistic people, ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
appear a certain way. And that, if they don't have those markers that we
Mm-hmm.
associate so commonly with some diagnosis, then they're lying or they don't need accommodation. Have you run into that?
Yeah, I last week I did a presentation at an HR conference for HR professionals, and they were listening and they're active, and but then they were like kind of like tuning out for a second, and so I was like, with perceptions of disability. So I was like, hey, you can't tell I'm autistic by looking at me. And they were like, ha 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 ha, laughing. Because they're like, and I was like, no, I'm serious. And they're like, oh, because, like, you know, or I'm like, I'm not using my cane today, so you can't tell. And they're just like, what? Like, I kind of like shattered what their perceptions of someone with disability was. Like, they thought I was just someone talking about it. I'm like, no, I have that lived experience. That's why I'm so passionate about it, for one, and then also, shattering their preconceived notions.
Because we always say, like, be honest, be authentic, like, show
Hmm.
your true self. And it does help for people to be able to see people in the workplace. But do you think people really hire when you put that on there? Because I often question that myself as I've become more
I think right now
transparent.
it's so interesting. But I think it's like employers like, oh yeah, we're a diverse employer and all these different things, and it's like sometimes it's like sometimes it feels like they're just doing it for a quota, and I'm trying to teach organizations that it's like if the person's qualified for the job, they want to do the job, they apply for the job, they tick all the boxes, they should be able to have the job.
I love that being willing to learn. And so, how can they find out more information about your group or more information about different services that are out there?
Yeah, so you can follow me on LinkedIn at Cindy Elaine Butler, or check out my website at accessiblecreates.ca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sydney. This was fantastic. I hope the listeners learned what they can do to assist and kind of like, reduce barriers. And, we'll have stuff at the end for how to contact Sydney if you want to learn more about what she does. And once again, thanks so much for joining us on 52 Weeks of Health Equity. Thanks, Sydney.